People have been reading the Bible for a long time, and along the way, certain key events have had a massive impact on how we understand it. For example, consider the 19th century. Charles Darwin's work, The Origin of Species, popularized the theory of evolution, which, among other things, challenged a literal reading of the early chapters of Genesis. The rise of historical criticism in biblical scholarship was also at work, encouraging interpreters to engage long-standing questions about the authorship and date and historical context of biblical books. For many readers, the findings yielded by this approach proved to be quite controversial. But perhaps the most important of all the events in the 19th century was the emergence of archaeology. In this video, we'll just focus on the textual finds. To put it simply, in the mid-19th century, archaeologists started finding a lot of texts. Thousands. One scholar even numbers the multiple discoveries in the millions. What makes these texts so valuable is the fact that they come from surrounding cultures that were roughly contemporaneous with that of the Bible. And here's the real kicker. Once people learned how to read these texts, which is a fascinating story in and of itself, they began to see some startling similarities with the Bible. The Mesopotamian Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, includes the story of Utnapishtim, a survivor of a large flood who has been granted immortality by the gods. In the text, one of the gods instructs Utnapishtim, demolish your house and build a boat, abandon wealth and seek survival, spurn poverty, save life, take on board the boat all living things' seed. For those familiar with the story of Noah in Genesis, it's a familiar start. A flood is coming, so build a boat. And much like its biblical counterpart, the text then provides the boat's dimensions and even claims that it should be covered in pitch, just like in Genesis. Further, Utnapishtim recalls, everything I owned I loaded aboard. All the silver I owned I loaded aboard. All the gold I owned I loaded aboard. All the living creatures I had I loaded aboard. I sent on board all my kith and kin, the beasts of the field, the creatures of the wild, and members of every skill and craft. In the Gilgamesh epic, the flood is described as a devastating 7-day event, the ferocity of which scared even the gods. And then it says, the ocean grew calm, the tempest grew still, the deluge ended. It was quiet and still, but all the people had turned to clay. Eventually, Utnapishtim's boat ran aground on Mount Nemush and remained in place for 6 days. And then, on the 7th day, he starts sending out birds. You can imagine the reaction of the first translators of this story, right? It's so similar to Noah. And it's not just Gilgamesh. There's a Sumerian text called Eridu Genesis with a flood story. There's another Mesopotamian epic, Atrahasis, which according to a text find in 2014, goes so far as to claim that Atrahasis loads the animals on the ark 2 by 2. There's even the mention of a flood in the Sumerian Kings list. And these stories, they probably predate the flood account in Genesis, which has led to all sorts of discussions about whether or not the Bible borrowed from other texts. Real quick, it's probably best to think about all these texts breathing the same air or floating in the same cultural river, rather than claiming that one borrows directly from another. Flood stories were just part of that world, and Noah is no different. These finds were a bombshell in the world of biblical studies. They have challenged some of our assumptions about the Bible, and even though the similarities seem scary, these texts have helped us to read the Bible better, more in line with its proper historical context. John Walton says the Bible was not written to us, but it was written for us, meaning it was written in a specific context, and it's not ours. If we are going to faithfully interpret the Bible, that is, if we are going to understand the world of those to whom the Bible was written, Dealing with this sort of information is really important. I know it's a lot to take in, but in the meantime, consider this. God reveals God's self in a language and idiom that people understand at that time. While we may have to work a bit to recover the language and idiom of an ancient people, we can at least be comforted that God continues to speak to us in a way that we can understand now. God is big enough and generous enough to do that. So while the flood stories might not be our cultural river, God has jumped into ours too. I'll post some links below if you want to learn more.